Hi, it's Chris Lingamfelter from Robot Advisors. We have a series that we're calling Argon Insights. Thanks to the folks at Argon Co. I sit down with each of the supply chain leaders at Argon and we talk about the interesting things that are happening in supply chain, useful information that you as a practitioner can use. So please enjoy the series. I'm here with Steve Mulaik, who's a partner at Argon Co. And this is our very first Argon Insights. So we're going to have a series of these chats where we talk about interesting things for warehouse and logistics operators. So first off, welcome, Steve.
Thank you. It's exciting to be here in the inaugural event.
Yes, yes. And as I get older, it becomes rarer and rarer for me to interview someone who's
older than you.
Well, or at least had more experience than me. And Steve is one of those rare folks who's been in this gig for longer than I have. But also very, very well respected by all your customers.
Thank you.
And that's really saying something. So, but tell us a little, first off, let's just give folks a little bit about Argon.
Okay, real quick. I mean, we're a global supply chain consulting firm. We got offices now all over the world, everywhere from Sydney all the way up to Chicago, through Europe, all those places, just about every continent except for Africa. 750 people doing primarily only supply chain stuff, everything from procurement to, like what we're going to talk about today, warehousing.
Excellent, excellent. And you yourself have been 30 plus years involved in...
Yeah, I got started in this before there were computers, so that's kind of scary.
Cardex was actual cards, right?
I remember showing up at the work, and there was there was admin people that created your graphics for you as a consulting firm. But yeah, I've primarily worked in and around warehousing and warehouse systems. But I've also, later on in my career, I got involved a lot with the warehouse design. And then ultimately, more recently, I've gotten involved with a lot of projects helping to turn around warehouses that are struggling, that have maybe invested in some major system or major material handling equipment that's just not working. And they need somebody to kind of referee and figure out what's wrong and fix it.
A lot of finger pointing, vendors.
Yeah, that can happen. That can happen. But you have to kind of sort out the fact from fiction, get some numbers behind what's most important, and then focus the team on fixing just those things. And we've had a lot of success with larger operations in doing that.
So you mentioned computers, and I think for this session we want to talk a bit about sort of the alphabet soup of control and
Warehouse
management
software,
systems and warehouse software. So started out with, of course, warehouse management systems, WMS.
Yeah, by far that's probably the one that most everybody would be familiar with. You know, the software that's used by the actual people that pick orders and receive goods in a warehouse. It's primarily used to record what happens. I mean, it also doles out work to some degree, but it really is more of a record keeper in my mind. I think it should have been called maybe a slightly different name because it doesn't really manage the warehouse.
And then, you know, I don't know, in the 70s, 80s, warehouse control systems came along to route cartons and containers around the warehouse.
And this is, it really, as the volumes climbed and you saw more and more, say, products that are selling quickly over the internet and buying in small quantities, the sophistication of those warehouses grew and the kinds of needs for lots of conveyor and other stuff became prevalent. And so software called warehouse control systems kind of bridged that gap between that conveyor that you needed and those devices and then the warehouse management system. So you could kind of get things flowing around inside of a building that somebody else would then use to pick orders with or something like that. So that's a very common layer as well in automated warehouse.
So you had your WMS talking to your WCS. And then about 10 years ago, we got this new acronym, your warehouse execution system, which somehow, in my mind, it fits in between the two. But I want to get your take on.
It's in a lot of this is a really common misconception. I think the term is used in two different ways, and I think we're seeing that finally we're going to differentiate. There are some people that call a warehouse execution something that sits between the WMS and the WCS.
Okay.
Some people do that. Some people, but that's
so
because
that's kind of where my head was.
Yeah, I know. I think, and it's because it takes on some of the control system functionality and some of the WMS functionality. But I think the one that's more interesting, the one that I really ascribe to, is above the WMS. It's kind of, I call it the great brain. You've heard maybe the term order orchestration.
Yes.
Kind of, this is something that sits on top of the WMS and also looks into the WCS to kind of find out what's going on in the conveyor as well as what's going on in the WMS as far as the people. And it starts to make decisions about how do you run your warehouse.
So should I take this batch of orders and pick them this way, cluster pick versus batch pick, or those kinds of
that
decisions?
That kind of decision can be made, but even more interesting is where should the people be? Now, this may not be a big deal in a warehouse that has 10 people working in it, but when you have 1,000 people, or 200 people, or 300 people, to keep everything going, especially if it's one of these facilities that has lots of mechanization, you have to have the right number of people in the right area doing the right job, because otherwise you just don't maximize your throughput. And if you spent $50 million on a solution and you're only getting half of it out, then that's a $25 million problem.
Well, and you also need to make sure the machine has a machine. Each of these different flows in the warehouse has a machine rate, and you want to keep them fed as well. So you don't want idle people, you don't want idle machines.
It's
right?
interesting when I think about who's the best provider of these brains that kind of control everything. Turns out it's a lot of these robot companies, and you're like, what, huh? Well, the reason the robot companies have gotten really good at orchestrating orders and stuff is because a lot of them get paid based on the pick. And so they want to keep those robots busy all the time. Well, I think a lot of these guys, they put their robots out there and they suddenly realize they're not picking all the time. So sometimes they're just standing around doing nothing. And you go, why is that? Well, it's because they're waiting on somebody, a person, to do something. And I think once some of the robot companies discover that, they architected software that not only told the robots what to do, but told the people what to do. And I think some of that software is useful in large buildings, even if you don't have any robots. In fact, some of the robot companies, the shrewd ones, are starting to sell it as an independent piece of software that you can buy to plug into your warehouse.
So going back, 1999, the internet explodes. Everyone starts to buy things online. People put in these complex systems.
UPS kind of
oh yeah, boop, 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 boop. The ticker. They're high-fiving, and then they start to go,
oh crap!
So you if a company put in a WMS and a WCS system in 1999, 2000, 2001, that's now 24, 22 years old, right? Now it's time to replace it. And so, we were talking, you're starting to see a real movement.
There's a lot of big companies that are starting to think about, okay, if we have to replace our WMS, should we also start thinking about adding this WES, my definition, order orchestrator, kind of on top of things, because it's not about, a lot of these big warehouses, it's no longer this issue of how do I make my people more efficient. It's really hard to make them more efficient. What you need to be worried about if you're a warehouse manager these days is everybody staying busy? And that's what these order orchestration engines do. They sit there and they monitor what people are doing, where the work is, to make sure you don't have two guys in a place you only need one. So they'll move into some place where they can be useful. They'll watch the conveyors and make sure they give preference for the merge point that sends stuff to value-added services, because they don't have any work right now, so let's give them work before we get packing. Packing has plenty of work. They're looking at machines, they're looking at people, keeping everybody busy.
Interesting. And so if I find myself, hey, I've got, my WMS system, my control system's a little bit long in the tooth, I can turn to an expert at Argon and say,
yeah, of course, we can do that. I mean, we'd love to do that. We do that kind of work. I think also if you're in the market for this kind of thing, it's kind of a new idea. So you're going to want to get some experience, I think, around this product category, because it's not real evident. You're not going to find some checklist out on the internet that shows this is what a WES or an order orchestration system does. It just doesn't. That hasn't been produced by anybody. Maybe I should do that, though. But nobody's got that out there. So it makes sense here because it has such a high impact on the overall operating cost of a building that you get good advice.
I've got to think also that, you're going to buy a new system that you're expecting to last 15, 20, 25 years. You want to buy that from a company that's going to support it over that time frame as well.
And that's where things get a little tricky, because
if you want to be on the bleeding edge, but also have
some of these companies,
you don't get fired by buying IBM, but you also, it doesn't.
We don't have that situation yet, I think, in this market. Well, there may be one, but generally this market's still full of a lot of really emerging players, which makes another reason why you want to get some good advice when you're going to be talking to people, because you don't want to buy something that's going to dissipate or disappear, in a couple of years. And I think there are things that you notice about how they architect the product, how they're building relationships or not building relationships with WMS providers, material handling equipment providers, that would kind of give you some indication that they're on the trajectory to survive. And I think that's a very important point, though, to bring up, is that it's not a super mature market with some dominant player that has 90% of the market. That has not happened yet. But over time, I think the better stuff will rise to the top. But right now, it's worth probably getting some advice on who are the guys that are floating up.
Well, Steve, thank you for sharing your insights with us on our first Argon Insights session here, and thanks for watching. Our next Argon Insights is going to be about peak readiness. We're sitting here in October. Peak is right around the corner for folks in the retail supply chain anyway. So we'll catch that one here in about a week.
Great.
Thanks, Steve.
No, thank you.